greetings to all of the colleagues who have been part of this project and taking us this far. And I also send greetings to participants who have joined online from various parts of the world. I think in many respects, the timing for both this project and the publication under the auspices of CODESRIA, the Journal Africa Development, could not have been better, in my view, for many reasons. Of course, in the first instance, over the last 20 or 30 years, many of us have been involved in intellectual struggles, sometimes political and policy struggles as well, to try to challenge what we mostly saw as a misreading, deliberate misreading of the early independence development experience on the African continent.
De l'élite initiale qui porte justement sur
into the 90s, into the early 1990s, as part of the effort to drive an agenda of structural adjustment on the African continent. And some of you might recall that in the context of that struggle, the World Bank and the IMF pushing a liberal market alternative to the state-led model of development, on the basis of which African countries entered into independent nationhood, was to argue that the first 2 decades of African independence were actually wasted years in the history of the continent. And therefore, rather pompously, what they were trying to do through structural adjustment was to retrieve something of that period and set Africa on a new path of development, which would be steered through the mechanism of the free market. Of course, the arguments which were proffered on why they considered the first 2 decades of independence to be wasted years were purely narrowly ideological, even doctrinal. The idea that state intervention was in and of itself a bad thing, what they called the statist model, having crowded out the private sector in Africa, and effectively following the publication of the book on the East Asian economic miracle. They claim also that the experience of the first 2 decades basically retarded Africa's transformation, especially given the fact that some of the East Asian tigers, Korea, South Korea, and Malaysia, for example, Indonesia, even to some extent, were more or less on the same level or slightly a notch below African countries at independence in the 1960s. But allegedly, because the East Asian tigers embraced a free market-led model of development as contrasted to African countries that took a state-led model. East Asia went on the rise and Africa was held supposedly in a state of stagnation and backwardness. Of course, the record of structural adjustment itself has been nothing but dismal. This has been amply documented in works which have been carried out by various African scholars, not least amongst them the book which, again, you might be familiar with, Our Continent, Our Future, that was written as a synthesis of a bigger project by Thandika Mkandawire and Charles Soludo, in which putting the first 2 decades of independence side by side with the 30 years of structural adjustment that subsequently followed, quite clearly the record of the first 2 decades were in all respects superior to what the structural adjustment period represented. And I think this in itself represented in its own right, perhaps the most powerful rebuttal in the late 1990s to the claims of the champions of structural adjustment. But even more than that, I think, was the important task of seeking to understand that period in its own terms, not necessarily in terms of a counterfactual against claims which, quite frankly, were infantile when one comes to think about them more closely. Claims from the Bretton Woods institutions that were purely infantile and doctrinaire in nature, was simply taking that experience and doing an analysis of what it meant in its own right in terms of the goals of the broad anti-colonial movement that ushered Africa into independence and the ambitions which African citizens defined for themselves in the newly independent countries. And I think it is in this particular respect that the Post-Colonialisms project has been particularly useful. Because in the first instance, it helps us to understand the early post-independence developmental experience in Africa, not just in terms of some narrow economic understanding of developments of the period, but in terms more broadly of the politics underpinning them, politics of nation and state building, for example, that were a central part of the thinking of the early nationalists. Because after all, African countries were ushered into independent nationhood as multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-regional societies that had themselves only started to recover from the divide and rule policies of the colonial period. And as several of the authors pointed out, it was perhaps not surprising that for citizens as for leaders alike, the question of how to build national unity was seen as one of the prime objectives of development policy in the post-independence period. And on top of that, building a state, because after all, the colonial state was itself created in the shadow of the imperial state as a subordinate entity which did not respond to internal or domestic processes and demands, but rather was constructed to serve an external imperial agenda, and therefore recalibrating the state and building a state worthy of its name in terms of its institutions and processes became again one of the most important objectives. And underpinning all of this was, of course, the whole goal of structural transformation, which is back in currency, by the way, after 30 years of structural adjustment, adventure with free market policies that have led nowhere. African governments under the auspices of the African Union and Agenda 2063 have explicitly stated that the goal of policy ought to be structural transformation. Those same issues that were central to policy in the early post-independence period. And so attention to questions of industrialization and the centrality of trade and industrial policy, which in some instances translated to the adoption of an import substitution model for building a manufacturing sector, adding value locally, but also questions of intersectoral linkages that began to be an important element of policy as part of an effort to ensure a much more balanced and diversified basis for economic transformation. At the third level was the central place of social policy, because after all, the entire colonial project, remember Mahmoud Mamdani, citizen and subject, who was a citizen, who was a native, and the discriminatory racialist basis on which the bifurcated state, colonial state, was built, spoke essentially to a policy that excluded the natives from the benefits of social policy and reserved this for the enclaves where the colonialists basically set up shop in most of the countries. And rectifying this, indeed, this discriminatory and exclusionary form of policy was one of the key drivers, one of the key motivators of the struggle for independence in most of our countries. Claims for education, claims for access to health, claims for access to basic services, potable water and the like, even road infrastructure, if one wanted to extend this a bit more. Strikes that demanded the provision of services and the withholding of taxes by peasant communities against the discriminatory measures that were experienced. All of these fed into the nationalist movement in the period after the Second World War and enabled us to move into an independence project with a clear idea of what a social contract between state and society in the post-colonial period could look like. And integral to that was the important place of social policy. And without exception, as again documented amply by the researchers in this project and scholars elsewhere, we saw spirited and determined efforts that were made to push the boundaries and to drive an agenda of transformation that integrated a social policy component within it. Universal access to education, access to primary health care, and so on and so forth, became highlights, a key highlight of public policy in the first 2 decades of independence. And progress was measured on an incremental basis with reference to these indicators of development, what later came to be baptized by the United Nations as an essential part of the Human Development Index, but which even at the time African countries embraced them, was not a concept which was in our vocabulary, but was integral to the idea of transformation that fired the early post-independence agenda. I think telling this story in an analytic way, not so much for the sake of propagandizing, because after all, that period also did have its discontents. Discontents, for example, around an insufficient attention to questions of how to overcome patriarchy and achieve greater gender balance and equality in many of the countries of the continent, of questions of a static, not sufficiently dynamic framework of state intervention. One can cite some of those challenges that confronted policy making and the development experience of the first 2 decades of independence. But that is a different story from the story which was told by the IMF and the World Bank in their critique of the first 2 decades of independence. And it is a story worth telling, particularly, I think, for a successor generation of African scholars and policymakers who today are immersed in a struggle around the decolonial. And we live in a moment of a resurgence of consciousness around decoloniality, in which from South Africa, you've heard of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, there's the Fees Must Fall movement, to Nigeria, where you have the EndSARS movement, to Senegal and much of Francophone Africa, where there is a rising against the CFA franc and a claim for monetary sovereignty, and so on and so forth. Movements which basically seek to reassert the African agency but unfortunately, which are not sufficiently, in a lot of cases, anchored in a proper understanding of history and of the experiences of the first 2 decades in a way that will enable us to draw lessons for the present and avoid repeating some of the mistakes of the earlier phase of the exercise of African agency.
Du passé, les erreurs les défis, les erreurs qui découlent des défis auxquels les institutions africaines.
This current contemporary decolonial moment represents an opportunity. I believe that this project also provides us a context and a framework within which to offer some lessons for today's generation of revolutionaries who seek to redress the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world in a manner that will give the continent a chance to finally transform itself for the benefit of the generality of the people. And here I think some of those who will have the opportunity to engage with the research that has been produced in detail will realize that simply dismissing all of the history of the continent from independence to date as representing an unmitigated disaster from a decolonial point of view will actually miss the point and will benefit from a much greater nuance that will show continuities as well as discontinuities between that earlier period and what we are confronted with today. And I hope, therefore, that as we go into a much more in-depth conversation in our breakout rooms, that we'll be able to have an extended conversation, an extended discussion around these specific elements of what history teaches us in terms of the development trajectory of the continent, where we are today in terms of the opportunities that are presented and what role policy and politics can play when properly set in a historical context and understood in terms of their antecedents to help drive a project of continental rebirth and renewal. A process of rebirth and renewal, which is to be distinguished, I should add, from the Africa Rising narrative that came and went like a flash in the sky, one which was celebrated mostly by international consultancy houses, and whose notion of an Africa that was rising in the first decade of this millennium was basically a narrative, if one were to put it as bluntly as possible, a narrative about an Africa that was rich for pickings, right? Essentially, when McKinsey tells you that the Lagos middle class consumes much more champagne today than the French middle class put together, and that Lagos as Nigeria as a destination for the export of champagne is a much more valuable market than the domestic market for champagne in France. And that is cited as evidence of an Africa that is rising. I think we have reason to be concerned and worried, because precisely this kind of consumerism that also fosters a massive dependency by the continent on an international system that is remarkable for its many asymmetries that work against the continent, is exactly what the early post-independence leadership tried to fight against, and to do so in a concerted and to some extent a coordinated manner that enabled us to see some of the changes in economy and society that were subsequently rolled back by the structural adjustment experience. And so when we speak of decoloniality today, it's also important that we put this in its proper historical context and understand that the struggles that were waged by the Kwame Nkrumahs or the Leopold Sedar Senghors or Gamal Abdel Nassers and others were in fact struggles of a foundational nature upon which today's champions of decoloniality can build and from whose experiences they can also draw lessons rather than a blanket dismissal of that experience that basically plays into the hands of an opposing epistemology, which basically does not give Africa any chance of developing agency other than being a market for the rest of the world and one that offers hefty and profitable returns to global capital. Thank you and enjoy the discussions.